As the third entry in the Hyrule Warriors series, Age of Imprisonment makes the most of the occasion by focusing on just a Nintendo Switch 2 release. There's no strings attached to the original Switch hardware, which gives developer AAA Game Studio carte blanche to optimize around Switch 2's Tegra T239 chipset. The big benefit in Age of Imprisoment's case really is that this one platform focus gives the series a much needed return to 60 frames per second play, or at least a valiant attempt at it. Once again, the Hyrule Warriors line offers a winning Zelda-themed spin on the Musou format, made most famous of course by Koei's Dynasty Warriors series, letting multiple interchangeable heroes charge across an open field, taking on virtual hordes of enemies. Except the series' bottleneck on a tech level, historically, has so often been on any given CPU's handling of so many on-screen enemies, and simultaneously, the huge level of alpha effects tends to hit the GPU hardest. Both combined, it's a massive stress test for any system. So, just how does Age of Imprisonment evolve its engine technology over the last two Hyrule Warriors games? And crucially, does Switch 2 capably hold a stable 60 FPS? Let's find out. Let's kick off with the basics first. From the outset, Age of Imprisonment demands a sizable 42.7GB install on Switch 2, which ranks among the larger titles for the system so far. And the reason why stems from a peculiar design choice. Having played around 4 to 5 hours into the story, it's clear that almost every cutscene is served up as a pre-rendered video. Very few cinematic moments are actually rendered in-engine on Switch 2 hardware, in other words, which is a bit of a shame, I think. Also, since Age of Imprisonment is such a heavily story-driven game, the choice to use a high volume of video encodes for every narrative beat almost certainly adds weight to that hefty 42.7GB install. It would have been fascinating to see Switch 2 actually tackle these scenes in-engine to see what it could handle, and also free up some internal storage in the process. Plus, another downside of this approach is that most cutscenes show visible compression. They all run at just 30 FPS with juddery, uneven frame pacing, and obvious banding and blocking artifacts. Meanwhile, actual in-engine gameplay on Switch 2 is sharper and runs at 60 FPS, so there's a visible disparity during the jump to controllable play. Again, it's a strange choice that seems to have more drawbacks than benefits. Thankfully, most of the fun is in the Musou-style action with a controller in hand. Speaking on image quality, the game uses dynamic resolution scaling, where Switch 2's docked play ranges between 720p to 900p, depending on the GPU demands within a battle. And playing Switch 2 in a portable state, this resolution range drops to 468p to 648p, accommodating the lowering in GPU core clock and memory bandwidth speeds while playing handheld. Fundamentally, the visuals are unchanged otherwise, whether played docked or portable, and given the effects-heavy nature of the game, these are pretty reasonable res targets overall, I think. The only mark against its image quality is the state of its anti-aliasing, or lack thereof. Once again, we're only seeing mention of AMD's FSR1 in its credits, which works as a spatial upscaler and also appears to sharpen the image. However, what FSR1 does not do is offer coverage for the game's stair-stepping or flickering. As a result, you'll easily spot fine detailed elements like grass shimmering on a camera pan, and also crunchy pixelated outlines to distant enemies. The best thing I can say of image quality here is that there's none of the ghosting we'd associate with modern temporal AA techniques. Everything is presented pretty raw, crisp and sharp, but with some visual noise in view as well. At its core, Age of Imprisonment still shows the series at a technical peak, as you might expect. The migration to Switch 2 in particular allows for significantly greater leeway for multiple overlapping effects, with seemingly hundreds of enemies flying across the screen, all at 60 FPS. Enemy design complexity is a huge leap over those in the previous Switch game, Age of Calamity, and while there is lingering pop into enemy shadows, the range at which shadows render in is much more generous this time around. To deal with those waves of oncoming enemies, there's of course a variety of attacks to get to grips with, each filling the screen with smoke, fire transparencies, and particles that light nearby terrain. The sheer range of attacking options here also helps enormously in creating a more complex reactive game overall. We have light and heavy attack combos. Zelda's unique abilities also allow her to slow down time and deflect leaping enemies, while fellow hero Mineru is able to summon these zonai constructs. There are counterattacks and sync strikes that combine two heroes into one special move, and even items like fire and ice emitters that target an enemy's weakness. Button mashing is a viable tactic to start, but there's also a genuine advantage to considering which hero and attack is best suited for the situation. All of this, of course, builds up to an impressive, at times bewildering maelstrom of effects, and much like in Calamity, there's even an on-rail shooter segment to spice things up between regular combat missions. It's a bit of a novelty, but it does help to mix up the flow of play. There are a few rough spots that need mentioning too. Mostly these relate to terrain quality, instances of low texture resolution, and geometry pop-in if you spend time taking in the scenery between battles. There's no screen space reflections here either, so water bodies end up looking rather flat and shorn of detail. In fairness, environmental shadows, notably shadows stemming from trees, do animate fully across the ground, but there are multiple LOD stages based on range to get to that point. Walking forward here, for example, first you get a fade-in of the shadow far ahead, then there are two level of detail switches affecting that shadow's quality, where the final LOD jump lets it animate fully. It's a nitpick, but even in the course of typical play, you're often charging through cleared areas of the map where these quirks stick out. On the whole, Age of Imprisonment is still a satisfying technical leap over the previous two games. So before we get to performance, let's look back at the Hyrule Warriors series evolution so far for context. The original Hyrule Warriors debuted as a Wii U title way back in 2014, with a later port to 3DS, and finally a definitive edition release on Switch in 2018. John and I reviewed this one back in the day, and it fundamentally proved overly ambitious for the original Switch hardware. The open field brawling ported directly across, but this Switch release boosted the 720p resolution seen on Wii U to a full native 1080p. On top of that, developer Omega Force unlocked the frame rate to 60 FPS rather than leaving a more realistic 30 FPS cap in place. The result being an impossible uphill battle for Switch to ever actually lock at the target 60, and frame rates instead waver wildly between 30 and 60 and underneath. This design choice, of course, pays off rather handsomely today on Switch 2. By simply running the Switch original on succeeding hardware, we're now getting a much tighter lock at 60 FPS at 1080p. There's no visual setting changes otherwise on Switch 2 since there's no patch. The environments are plain by today's standards with low resolution textures, obvious enemy fade-in, and shadows that pop into view visibly ahead. Still, Switch 2 realizes the full potential of that peak frame rate, and it makes this first game the smoothest playing entry in the series to date as a result on this hardware. Next along, the second game, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, released in 2020 just for the original Switch, moving to more of a cel-shaded aesthetic closer to Breath of the Wild's. Environmental complexity increased with denser grass and more trees strewn across the field, and despite their high count, enemy designs were also improved, though with plenty of shadow and terrain pop-ins still in view. Age of Calamity also reverted to a 30 FPS cap this time, which seemed a sensible move given the wavering results of the first game. The catch being that, as you can see, the original Switch struggles to hit that target, with 20 to 30 FPS play from the very first mission. Again, this is something that Switch 2 fixes by brute force of more GPU horsepower. All of which leads us to Age of Imprisonment's performance on Switch 2 today. Yes, thankfully, the 60 FPS target makes a grand return this time around, which feels perfectly suited for the series' brand of chaotic combo-heavy action. Especially this time around, dodging, blocking, and countering enemy attacks with unique abilities is more imperative to victory than ever before, and that 60 FPS response makes a big difference. Still, the reality is that Switch 2 isn't able to get a constant lock at 60, and you'll easily spot drops under the target. As a rule of thumb, it's often at the top of the graph, and it's often more successful in doing so than Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition was on the original Switch back in the day. But as soon as those on-screen effects crank up to extreme levels, the game delves into the 50s. Essentially, any sudden burst of effects, which is a frequent event in this case, causes a lurch to 55 FPS or so, and lower might be possible further into the story. Curiously, a later mission in Chapter 2 cranks up the enemy count, and here it seems that there's no real sign of any CPU side limit in handling the collision logic for multiple AI. Rather, drops coincide with more typically GPU side bottlenecks, which the game's dynamic resolution helps to minimize after the fact. This framerate behaviour is also true of Switch 2's portable play. Lowering the game's resolution to a dynamic 648p does indeed help in keeping 60fps in view while in handheld mode, but it's clear that there are similar lurches into the 50s here. As ever, it's not possible to test this precisely with our usual analysis tools, given that Switch 2's own video capture only spits out a 30fps feed. But the cadence of drops here is comparable to docked play, judging purely by eye. At this point, it's also worth mentioning the game's two-player co-op mode. Using a split-screen view, Hyrule Warriors is an ideal candidate for couch co-op here. Two players are freely able to swap between any available heroes and coincide attacks as they please across a giant map. The one downside is that, as you can see, the frame rate does cap at 30fps and with uneven frame pacing no less. Mostly it is a stable 30fps in principle, but the manner in which frame times trill between 16, 33 and 50 milliseconds makes the action feel less smooth than it should. As a workaround, if a friend brings their own Switch 2 around, it is possible to use the game's local multiplayer mode, even via game share, which gives each console their own view of the map at 60fps. Five years on since the last installment, Age of Imprisonment shows the Hyrule Warriors series going from strength to strength. The sheer entertainment factor is high with this one, despite some rough edges in image quality and pop-in. The open field battles build to moments of genuine chaos, with a high enemy count and effects pushing Switch 2 beyond what was possible before. In this sense, it's a more comfortable pairing of hardware and technical ambition all round, where previous series entries truly struggled to hit their framerate targets, whether that's 30 or 60fps on original Switch hardware. Even with the framerate dips in this third game, which are unfortunate, the return to a 60fps target is still vastly preferable to a 30fps cap, and clearly benefits the speed of its action. All of which makes the reliance on 30fps pre-rendered videos for cutscenes a bit of a disappointment. In some cases, for simpler story beats or character dialogue, using pre-rendered videos seems a bit excessive. On the whole though, Age of Imprisonment still comes well recommended. Even if you're not fully up to speed on the surrounding Zelda lore, the on-field action and the range of moves and abilities offer enough depth here. And as a Switch 2 release, it boasts a satisfying enough technical leap over the first two Switch games to be worth checking out. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. Please do check out our Patreon to support us at Digital Foundry, and to get in touch with myself or the team, you know where to find us. But from me for now, thanks for watching.